Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the RSM's In Conversation Live. My name is Richard Murley. I am a trustee of the Royal Society of Medicine, and it's my great pleasure to introduce this evening Lord Prior of Brampton, David Prior, who is the chairman of NHS England, which, as I'm sure you all know, is the commissioning body for the whole of the NHS in England and has, bluntly, all of the money. David, good evening. It's very good of you to join us. Thank you very much indeed.
Hello, Richard. Thank you for having me.
So I think our audience has probably seen your CV, and you've had a long and varied career in the private sector, the public sector, and in politics. Like me, you have many connections with Suffolk. And of course, your father was Jim Prior, the very well-known politician in the Thatcher era. What effect did being the son of a well-known politician have on your plans for your career? And was that a big factor in you going into politics in your career?
Yeah, I think it probably was, although I've got three brothers and sisters and none of them had any interest in going into politics at all. So it had an effect on me. It didn't have an effect on them. I mean, you say that my father was a politician of the Thatcher era. I mean, he was actually really a politician of the Macmillan Heath era, in truth. He went into the House of Commons in, I think, 1959. And so, you know, like many others, his politics were very much shaped by the sort of the pre-war and the war years. And I think that gave people a very different perspective. So you're right, he was in the Thatcher cabinet, of course, but he was very much a creature of the 60s and 70s, as well as the 80s.
And has he passed on, or did he pass on his sort of political perspective? I mean, he was a well-known dissident, if you like, in the Thatcher cabinet when I was growing up, and he certainly didn't come across as one of us in Thatcher terms. Did he pass on that perspective and those views to your approach to political issues?
Yeah, I think he did. Although, funnily enough, if you were to ask either him or me, sort of separately, I think we would both say that Mrs. Thatcher called it right by and large, and that she will be seen for many years to come as the sort of pivotal change that took place in Britain in 1980. You know, whether was our attitude towards Russia and the Cold War, or whether it was the change to the economy in the UK. I mean, she was, along with Attlee, I guess, one of the two great transformative peacetime prime ministers, you know, since the war. So I think temperamentally, probably both my father and myself were not natural Thatcherites, but I think we would both accept that she was a remarkable prime minister.
Well, it's obviously striking, and we're very lucky to be talking to you today, you know, in the aftermath of Boris Johnson's announcement yesterday, which is obviously of huge significance for the NHS as a whole. But also, of course, because we are going into a period where we're going to have the highest level of tax, I think I read, for many decades, which of course would have been anathema to Mrs. Thatcher. So the timing is very interesting. You started your career in the city, and then I think spent some time at British Steel. What was it that, I mean, how did you get into politics in the end?
Well, British Steel, you know, that was the most formative time of my sort of early career, if you like. I mean, I love the steel industry. I mean, anyone who's worked in Port Talbot in Wales, or Ravenscraig in Scotland, or on Teesside or Sheffield, and just seen the extraordinary changes that happened to a traditional industry at the time, and actually seen the devastation in some of those sort of coal mining and steel making areas during the 80s. I mean, that really, I think, probably shaped my political career subsequently more than anything, because you know, what we were doing in the steel during the 80s, when we were, you know, closing a lot of plants and making a lot of people redundant, was the right thing to do. But the social consequences of doing that were searing, and that has never really left me. So my time in the steel business was, you know, as I said, was very formative, and I think that probably led me to go into politics as much as anything. a feeling that actually, if you really wanted to make change, you have to be in politics. You know, you can fiddle about at the edges in industry or in the city or wherever, but actually, if you really want to be part of the change, you've got to be in politics, and then that's really what took me into politics.
As an East Anglian man, you became, I think, MP for Norwich. Talk to us, if you would, about what's it like being an MP? Did you enjoy it? Did you feel that you could really make a difference from the back benches?
Well, it wasn't Norwich, actually. It was North Norfolk. So it was a very rural, sort of agricultural constituency, really. And actually, I loved that time. And actually, one of my biggest career regrets was losing the election in 2001 to Norman Lamb, a Liberal Democrat, who actually is a friend of mine. So it's not that there was no personal animosity. There was at the time, but there certainly isn't anymore. Who was an outstanding constituency MP, actually, for North Norfolk. I think that being a constituency MP on its own was really of little interest, to be honest with you. I mean, I enjoyed parts of it, but if you're going to make a difference, you've really got to be in government. And, you know, I was an MP from 1997 onwards when Tony Blair was in his sort of heyday, and there was no chance of having any impact on anything at the time. So if I'd stayed as an MP, and I might have done reasonably well when David Cameron became Prime Minister in 2010. And I think to have been a Secretary of State for Health or Education or the Chancellor, one of those roles would have been extraordinary. And I think if you're going into politics, most people, if they're honest, they want to get their hands on some power. And to do that, you've got to be in government. No good bigger backbencher.
Yeah. So you obviously, as you say, lost your seat, and then you moved to the NHS, where on and off you have been for the bulk of your career since, in a variety of roles. And you started, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, as chairman of the Norfolk and Norwich. How did you get into the NHS then?
Well, it's very strange, but I mean, I had thought when I went into politics that that was going to be my career, and suddenly on the day, and I remember that day when I lost the election, it was pretty traumatic. Actually, I knew it was going to be very close, and suddenly, you know, you haven't got a job, you haven't got anything, literally overnight. I think you get 3 months' pay, I think, as an MP, you know, to sort of help you tide over to the next thing. And so I was looking around what to do, and the chairmanship of the Norfolk and Norwich was coming up, and I had known the hospital pretty well as the local MP, and you know, I'd obviously used the hospital. My family had used the hospital in the past, and it was in many ways the hospital is the biggest employer in Norfolk. You know, they are, as you know from your own time at UCLH, these are huge beasts. I think in the Norfolk and Norwich, it employed best part of 10,000 people, something like that. And was a very big sort of economic factor in Norfolk, and it seemed like an incredible challenge, particularly as they'd just done a big PFI, so moving into a new hospital. So it had a lot of financial challenges as well as all the other challenges of running a hospital. So I went for it, and I very luckily got it. And you know, 20 years later, I'm still in the NHS.
So what lessons did you take away, or we can exchange views on this, what lessons did you take away from chairing a trust? Because you also succeeded me for a short while at UCLH, a rather different hospital, but you know, still with many of the same elements. What did chairing a hospital teach you?
Well, humility, I guess, Richard, more than anything. They are incredibly difficult things to run. I'm not sure anyone runs a hospital anymore. I mean, they're so big, so complex. I mean, the clinicians used to run hospitals. I remember at Norwich back in the sort of 70s and early 80s, when they only had about 100 or even probably 60 consultants. Everyone knew everybody, and a small group of consultants would run the hospital with an administrator. There is no way that can happen anymore. And the idea that, quotes, the matron, end quote, should run the hospital is equally absurd. You know, these are massively complicated, difficult organizations with a huge diversity of people within them. So, you're running at one level a sort of a professional services business with, highly intelligent, well-trained doctors. At the same time, you've got to keep the hospital clean, catered for, the laundry's got to be done. So it's a wide sort of collection of different people. So I think humility really, and when people in the centre sort of say, well, get your length of stay down or improve your 4-hour wait in A&E, I know just how hard it is to do that. I mean, UCLH, I remember going around the theatre block early on when I went there. I mean, incredibly hard to run theatres really efficiently in a very busy hospital that's got all the A&E demand coming in on it. You never quite know how many beds you've got, whether that's in the high dependency unit or in the main hospital. I mean, incredibly hard to do. So I think if there was one word that I would use, I don't know whether you'd share this view or not, it would be humility. I mean, compared to running Rothschild's where you were, or one of the merchant banks, or running a car factory or a supermarket, hospitals are very difficult.
Yes, well, we had a very distinguished non-executive director who had been a director of a big process plant company in the US. And he said, you put the raw, it's like steel, you put the raw material in at one end, a process happens and the finished product comes out at the other end. And superficially, as a product person, you think that's the case in a hospital. But of course, the human element intervening at all points is so significant that the analogy just evaporates.
It does.
That's the complexity and the interest and the enjoyment.
And it's also, it's very easy, isn't it, to say how inefficient the NHS is or how inefficient the hospitals are. And of course, at one level, they are inefficient. If you compare it to a supermarket or a car plant. But if you look around the world at other systems, they're no more efficient than we are. Arguably, we are more efficient. If you look at the sort of the metrics like length of stay or day procedure rates or administration costs, you'll find the NHS does compare very favorably. But that's because all healthcare is inefficient, because all healthcare, whether it's in Japan or America or France or Germany or England, is equally difficult for the same reasons that you just gave.
Yeah. Well, that's probably quite a good introduction to the next stage in your career, because you then, if I got it right, went to the chairman of the Care Quality Commission, and a different role. I suppose you're more of a gamekeeper than a poacher, moving to being a regulator. The CQC has attracted a huge amount of criticism from various people in the system as being rather a blunt instrument. It doesn't achieve what it set out to do. You'll be very familiar with those criticisms. With a bit of hindsight a few years out, what's your view on how the CQC works and whether it does what it's supposed to do?
Well, I'm not a natural regulator, Richard, to be honest with you. So I'm not predisposed to think that the regulator can actually drive improvement, for example. The question is, I ask myself the question pretty well every day: how do you drive innovation and improvement into a healthcare service like the NHS? And we've tried we've tried to mimic the market. We had an internal market. We had the provider purchaser split. We've had very strong top-down performance management. We've tried every way of driving improvement. We've tried. Now, regulation can have two functions, it seems to me, and it can try and spot things that are failing. And if you remember, when I went to CQC, it was in the aftermath of the Mid-Staffordshire crisis and disaster. We'd had the maternity problems at Morecambe Bay. It was quite clear that a number of hospitals were failing, or parts of hospitals were failing. And that was equally true of social care as well. You might remember Winterbourne View, which was a hospital for people with severe learning difficulties, where there'd been some terrible, the culture had gone really badly wrong. And that is true of a number of small residential care homes as well. So to try and spot things when they were going wrong, and to move in when they were going wrong, was absolutely the right thing to do. So I don't look back and feel any reticence about saying there is a need for a CQC or something like the CQC. And I did feel at the time when we sort of set it up that we could develop a range of metrics that will be predictive in their nature, and that we should be able to spot problems before they manifested themselves in patients with patient safety problems. So I do believe there's a role for CQC at that point to spot failure. When it comes to driving improvement, that is a different matter. And I am highly skeptical as to whether or not CQC or any regulator can really drive improvement, drive the top end, if you like, the sort of the top hospitals to make them better. And certainly, I think there would be very few clinicians who would say that their clinical work has improved as a result of reading a CQC report. So I think there is a role for regulation, but we shouldn't overstate it. And I think the sadness I have about CQC is that we have not been able, or it has not been able to develop a series of predictive metrics that could replace these very heavy-handed, very laborious, and very expensive visits that we used to do. I just had to hold up my hand and say I don't think those visits have been the right way of doing the regulation. But unfortunately, we were not able to find a more effective sort of metrics-driven system that could replace them.
Yes, certainly in my hospital, I'm sure the audience will recognise this, the sort of day-to-day management function ground to a halt in advance of a CQC visit, as everybody got their act together, prepared all the paperwork and so on. Some of that was good, but I think not all of it, as you say.
No, and okay. I think as well, think about if it's data-driven, so that you know there's an issue in the maternity department, for example. But I mean, how can you, if you take UCLH, which you know well, it's on multiple sites, it employs 15,000 people, it's multi-specialty. How on earth can a 2-day visit, however many people you have on the visit, actually get under the skin of a hospital like that? I mean, it can't. And so therefore, I think the inspection regime, unless it's highly targeted, and you need good people on the inspection. There's no point turning up in the paternity department at UCLH with people who are not treated as serious people by the obstetricians and the senior nurses. There's no point. So, and the really good people don't want to spend their time going out on an inspection. So there is a dilemma there, I think.
So after the CQC, you went back into the political arena, didn't you? You became a minister firstly in the DH, and then you moved over, I think, to what many of us think is the Department of Industry, but I can't remember what it was called in your incarnation. It keeps changing its name, but you were an industry minister. Just looking at industry, I think one of the key things you were responsible for was the industrial strategy that was published. And from a health perspective, the life sciences industry and our biomedical sector, the research side, which I know has been near to your heart through all of this. Can you talk a bit about your perspective of where research stands and where we stand? Because certainly the academic community generally was viscerally opposed to Brexit and felt that it was going to be deeply damaging for what was seen as a global industry with particularly strong European links. How do you think we are positioned now as a nation in what is a core area of strength?
I think our academic medicine and our sort of life science industry in the UK, and I would include within that not just sort of biotech, but also the sort of artificial intelligence and machine learning and sort of data science as well, is extraordinarily high. And it's partly in our great universities. They tend to be Oxford, Cambridge and London, but not exclusively. Partly in institutes like the LMB at Cambridge and the Crick in London. but also within our great hospitals. We have an extraordinary sort of competitive advantage. I remember, I think it was when John Kenneth Galbraith went to India in about 1946 to advise Nehru on how to create a modern economy in India. And he said, you've got to found 10 universities and then wait for 300 years. And now look, that I agree. I know that Imperial hasn't been there that long, but you know what he means. That sort of academic research culture, it takes a long time to grow and develop, and we've got it in the UK. There's no question that the Golden Triangle can compete with Boston and Silicon Valley, if you like, in its excellence of clinical output. And I think the COVID times has really proven that. If you look at the genomic sequencing that's been done over that time, I think we did more sequencing of the virus in the UK than the rest of the world put together. The development of the vaccine, the recovery trial run by Martin Landray at Oxford has been, I think the UK's life sciences has come through this incredibly well. Now, I think the issue that we need to look at ourselves very carefully on and within the NHS is on how we run clinical trials in the UK. And we are falling way behind at the moment on the number of people we're putting through clinical trials. That's partly because of COVID, but it's partly, I think, because the pressure on clinicians who have an academic interest to, if you like, do the day job, which is getting the waiting list down and dealing with patients, can sometimes push their research interest right to the margin of what they're doing, to our detriment, I think, because I do believe that this very close relationship between universities and teaching hospitals is at the heart of our sort of life sciences and very important. You mentioned Brexit. Well, I wasn't in favor of Brexit. Actually, I don't think it's done a lot of damage to life sciences. I thought it was going to do damage, but there's not very much evidence of academics leaving the UK and going elsewhere. And actually, I happen to think that the regulatory system, if you look at the MHRA, for example, is now enabling us to be much more agile and much quicker. And I think the fact that we're now probably working closer with the FDA in the US, still working closely with the EMA as well, is a good thing. So actually, I have not seen any serious sort of diminution in our competitive advantage in life sciences. Indeed, the contrary, I would say. I think in a sense, we've gone from strength to strength. So although it's quite hard when you look around the UK to see where we really have competitive strength, we definitely have competitive strengths in this area. And interesting, when I was doing the industrial strategy work for when I was a minister in BEIS, it's business, energy, and industrial strategy, the clue is in the name. The city, creative industries, and the life sciences are really the three areas where we have this competitive strength, and I think we've still got it.
Okay, well, maybe at this point there are questions coming in on the Q&A function, and if people do have questions, let's please see them in the Q&A. Just picking out a question from that, going back to an earlier point in your career. Question from David Cochrane. With world steel prices at an all-time high, is there any prospect of resurrecting steel in the UK?
I don't think so, regrettably. I put one caveat to that, which is that if we could come up with a system for producing steel, which was carbon neutral at any rate. I mean, if we could really transform the process of making steel, then possibly. But I mean, your questioner obviously knows a bit about the steel business. He obviously follows steel prices, and steel prices are very high. But absolutely with a racing certainty that if they're high today, they're going to be low tomorrow. It is highly cyclical. There is massive overcapacity around the world in steel making, particularly in China and in Asia. And I think it's inconceivable that we'll go back to being a major steel producer. I mean, and as a country, if you had to choose where to put your capital investment and your future, it will be in things like nuclear fusion or robotics, in those areas, or in life sciences indeed, rather than the steel business. I say that with great sadness, but I love the steel business. It was as I said, it was the most formative part of my life, and so it has a sort of a romantic flavour about it. The steel, you know, in places like South Wales, where it was so much part of the community. But I'm afraid that those days are gone.
Okay, and a CQC question. Could the CQC be enhanced by some form of focused peer review from Martin Mellish?
A peer review by Martin Mellish? Or
no, the questions from Martin Mellish. Well, maybe he's volunteering.
Well, they are peer reviewed. You know, before they're done, they are checked through. And I don't think so. I don't think it's the quality of the reports that is the problem. It's just that it is just a very heavy-handed form of regulation. And we tried to slim it down. We tried to make it more targeted. We tried to make it more sort of metrics driven, if you like. I mean, the sad thing is, and it's a question for some of the people, frankly, listening to this this interview, is how can this happen? You know, I look at the clinicians, you know, on this. How could it happen in mid-staffs? You know, how can the culture get so bad that the doctors were not putting their hands up and talking about it and raising issues? You know, how did Mr. Patterson get for so long practice in the West Midlands, you know, the breast surgeon, without someone, you know, putting up their hands? And I think this cultural issue is a very difficult one to address. And actually, what was really interesting to me was that the most revealing of all the metrics that one would look at in the CQC would be the junior doctor survey, because they did know what was going on. They knew exactly what was going on. But I had to ask myself, where were the senior doctors at mid-staffs? And it's a question you were asking me before this interview, Richard, and we've debated it many times in the past, is why do so few doctors go into senior management? I mean, I spent half a day last week at the Cleveland Clinic with Brian Donnelly, who's the CEO of Cleveland Clinic. I mean, you could not have a chief executive of the Cleveland Clinic or the Mayo Clinic or any of these great hospital chains in America who were not clinicians. It would be inconceivable.
Brian's an orthopedic surgeon, isn't he?
He's an orthopedic surgeon, and not true in England. And this awful cultural sort of, everyone still refers to the dark side, don't they? I mean, so
I should volunteer my statistic at this point, which is that when towards the end of my time, before I passed the baton to you at UCLH in London, we put out an advert for a successor to Robert Naylor as chief executive. We had a number of applications from the UK and a large number from overseas. I think none of the UK applicants was a doctor, and all of the foreign applicants was a doctor. Why do you think that is?
I think it's mainly a cultural issue, Richard. I think it's the way the NHS has developed over, well, for many, many years, but it's to do with remuneration, it's to do with job security. I think the trouble is too many clinicians think that they can approach these very serious management positions in a rather amateurish way. You know, we'll sort of fit it in around our clinical work. I mean, you cannot run a hospital like that anymore. These are big, serious organizations that require serious people to run them. And I think in the US and in Europe, clinicians will often do an MBA, so they will have very strong sort of financial and management training as well, which you need to have. But I think it's, you know, I mean, there's Dave Rosser in Birmingham, there's Bruno Haltap in Oxford. There are a number of clinicians who are running hospitals. I mean, not all clinicians make great chief executives, I should add, and there are some fabulous chief executives who are not clinicians. But it's counterintuitive, isn't it, not to have doctors and more doctors running hospitals? But there we are. It's the way we are, and it's going to take a long time to change, I think.
Well, as we were discussing earlier, today's an interesting day in the life of the NHS. Obviously, a huge injection of money coming in as a result of the Prime Minister's announcement yesterday. How do you react to the extra money, and how will it be spent?
Well, I think it's the right decision. I mean, it's not as if the NHS is a overfunded institution. I mean, you know, we are underfunded compared to most European systems and way underfunded compared to the American system. So despite some people in the right wing part of the Conservative Party, you know, this is not just a black hole where money just disappears. I think on the whole, the taxpayer gets good value from the NHS. It's not perfect, of course, we've discussed that earlier, but they get pretty good value. So look, the extra money that's coming in is against the background that we still have got 7,500 people with COVID in our hospitals. We've taken out between 10 and 15,000 beds because of all the infection control procedures. Productivity has taken a big hit because of the infection control procedures. That's added probably between £3.5 and £4 billion a year to our costs across the piece. So that's part of the answer. The second part is that we have a waiting list now of 5.5 million people on the waiting list. We think that it could easily grow to around 10 million. The Secretary of State mentioned 13 million as people who should be on the who should have come on the waiting list over the last sort of 2 years have not come onto it. So another big chunk of that money is going to go into catching up, if you like. I mean, what we've got to be very careful of is that money is spent well, that it doesn't go into, I mean, Richard, you were, I think, in the health service back in the mid-2000s when the Labour Party put a lot of money when Labour government put a lot of money into the health service. We ended up with a consultant's contract, a GP contract, a lot of surgeons, particularly orthopedic surgeons, are making a lot of money, if we're honest, at the time by doing a lot of that work at private sector rates, and all the spillover into other parts of the hospital that caused. What we can't do is have a repeat of that. We have got to deal with this waiting list, and that will mean as well, I'll say it completely openly, that means working with the private sector, frankly. I've got no problems with doing that. I think the private sector performed incredibly well during COVID. So I think between the NHS and the private sector, we've got to really go for productivity and really hit that waiting list hard. That's where I see the money going.
Okay, well, there's just to, I think, put a finer nail in that question from John Crowd. Does increasing the amount of money going into the NHS improve the service or just increase pay for managers?
Well, I mean, it certainly is not going to increase the pay to managers. I mean, as I said earlier, last time this happened, it did quite a lot. I don't know whether John is an orthopedic surgeon or not, but I mean, some people did quite well last time a lot of money came into the NHS. It certainly won't go to manage. I mean, let's be quite frank about this. I think the management cost of the NHS is around 3% of the total cost. It's a very small part of the total cost base of the NHS, so it certainly won't go to managers. I think there's clearly a very strong argument that nurses in particular should be paid better. But I think we just got to make sure that the vast bulk of that money goes into doing more operations to hit that waiting list.
So turning to the reforms, the white paper, the legislation, I'm sure many doctors have seen reforms come and go, different structures come and go. They're still there, the nurses are still there, the building's still there, the patients are still there. Addressing, I suspect, our largely medical, but not exclusively medical audience, what are they going to notice when the reforms come in?
Well, I'm going to talk about a reform that probably you're not thinking about. You're thinking about integrated care systems, and I suspect the reform as we move from a less fragmented into a more integrated system. For me, the major reform that's going to happen is the way that the digital world is going to come into, and the use of data is going to come into healthcare, and that I think could have a huge difference in the way we deliver care. So I don't think you probably didn't want me to answer it in those terms, but I think that will have a bigger impact than integrated care systems. Now, I happen to be in favour of integrated care systems, so long as they're not insular, so long as they're looking outwards, so long as they don't reject innovation coming in from the private sector and elsewhere. But I think a more joined up system, particularly between social care and healthcare, that makes a huge amount of sort of common sense. And in fact, the discharge to assess scheme that ran through the COVID period took about 10,000 people out of hospital who'd otherwise be there, and put them in much lower cost environments like care homes, for example, freeing up beds in hospital. It's just one example of how social care and healthcare can work together more closely. But I think the really big change will come through the digital revolution, if I can put it. I remember Paul Corrigan, who was a advisor to Tony Blair, saying, I think 4 or 5 years ago, that the telephone, the phone, the mobile, the smartphone in your pocket will know more about you and your healthcare than your doctor will. And I think there's some truth in that. And I think we will see a move towards digital health that will be as transformational as the sort of as digital has been to the banking world, and not your world directly in the merchant banking world, but if you look at the way that the banking world has been transformed over the last 5 years, I think healthcare will move in the same direction.
But enormous amounts of money have been spent in the banking world on the infrastructure, on training, on the software. The NHS is probably bigger. And the task is equally great, and they start much further behind the banks. Is that money going to be available? Is that in the Prime Minister's cheque from yesterday?
It's not in the cheque from yesterday, because yesterday's cheque was a revenue cheque, not a capital cheque. But if we don't have the capital to enable us to move to electronic health records, for example, across the piece, and we don't have the capital to get our data properly integrated. I'm talking about the genomic data, the healthcare record data, and of course, developing the NHS app. If we don't have the capital to do that, then this transformation will not happen. I mean, the tragedy for the NHS was that they had the capital to do that back in 2004-5, when Tony Blair championed the NP, it was called at the time, the National Programme for Information Technology. And it was a failure, and that set us back 10 years. We're now catching up, but I mean, we've got a long way to go, Richard. But I think when we do get there, it will be genuinely transformational.
Now, there are a couple of questions from our audience about care. Alistair Philp and Martin Mellish, Alistair Philp and another colleague are asking, do you think England will follow Scotland in setting up a national care service? I mean, yesterday's announcement was quite light on what's actually going to happen. It was all about the money and what people would pay, but there was really, I think, directionally nothing on actually improving the service. How do you see that developing?
Well, that's a very good and perceptive question. And the answer is not a very good one, which is that there's going to be a white paper to address that very issue, but it's going to be out before the end of October. And there will be a further paper produced called on integration of social care and healthcare. Now, whether a national care service emerges from that is too early to say. I think there's a lot to be said for it. I think it's worth just noting, though, two things. One, much social care will continue to be means tested, whereas, of course, the national healthcare is not means tested. We can't afford to go to a universal free service for social care. The economy simply can't afford that. And the second point to note is that, of course, in Scotland, they do have, I know there are any Scots on this call, but we do subsidise Scotland pretty heavily. And so they are able to spend more money on public services than we are. I think we subsidise them to the tune of something like £2,500 per capita, something like that, from England to Scotland. So we don't have as quite a generous public service as Scotland does. But nevertheless, having a much more joined up social care and healthcare service makes a huge amount of sense.
Perhaps talk about staffing, which I think is one of the critical issues and one of the ones that's hardest to solve, I think, in the short term, and I know is one of Amanda Pritchard's top priorities. There's a question from Anne Russell, which talks about part of it. Would the speaker accept that the recent decrease in the number of nurses in the NHS is in part a result of Brexit? In order for doctors to offer clinical trials to patients, researchers are needed and they're just not there. That's just one part of the professions where there is a shortage, and this obviously takes a long time to sort out. What are your thoughts on that and the outlook there?
Well, the evidence suggests that there is the demand from young people, men and women, for going into nursing is very high now. We've got a lot of people who want to go into nursing, and that's one of the slightly paradoxical results of COVID, is that suddenly going into the caring professions has become actually more popular with young people. And I think as well, I take the Brexit point, but if you take what's happening in the retail industry, suddenly there aren't as many jobs in retail as there used to be. So in a way, I know it takes time to train a nurse and a lot more time to train a doctor, but actually I don't think there's any evidence at all to suggest that people do not want to go into either of those two professions, doctoring or nursing. And as you know, we've got more places in medical school now than we had a couple of years ago. So I'm not too downhearted in longer term. There's a short-term dislocation maybe caused by Brexit, but I don't think it's nothing like as significant as I thought it was going to be.
Well, obviously the extra money is coming in, as discussed yesterday. Quite a punchy question from David Whitaker. Surely paying orthopedic surgeons to do extra cases is probably the most effective way to get money to directly fund patient care. Much better than the NHS funding the IT industry, etc.
Well, I'm all for paying. Look, many of my best friends are orthopedic surgeons, and I'm in awe of what they do. And I know for a fact that the one thing they do want to do is operate on patients. And one of the most frustrating things that has happened over the last couple of years is their inability to do so. And that goes back, I might add, way before COVID, when we had similar problem with not enough beds, they couldn't operate, and the orthopedics always get pushed to the back of the list because they're not as important as the cancer patients, for all the reasons we know. And we absolutely want orthopedic surgeons to be operating, but we want them to be operating at normal terms and conditions in the NHS. And what we don't want is to find, as happened back in the early 2000s, that we have to do these extra operations at private sector rates.
Can we talk a little bit about general practice? We read constantly in our newspapers about a crisis in general practice. There seems to me to be far more criticism of GPs among my friends and contacts, and indeed in the media, than was the case a few years ago. GPs say they are under enormous pressure. There's this series of comments that it's so hard to see GPs in person at the moment. They're all retiring early. How do you see a way through this? What is the future of general practice, and what will its role be in the NHS in a few years' time, do you think?
Well, it's the variation, isn't it? Because there are some people get a phenomenally good service from their local primary care general practice. Other people find it almost impossible to get access to it, and sadly, it tends to be areas of social deprivation and where actually you need more primary care, where access issues are greater. It's the variation, I think, which is the real problem. I mean, as I said, I think where general practice is well staffed and where there are enough doctors, you get a fantastic service. We have to look beyond general practice, though, don't we? When we're talking about primary care, it's not just about GPs. And we also had to look at remote consultations as well. This is going to happen. I mean, of course, some people need to be seen face to face. It's not an either or. It's an and both in terms of digital remote monitoring and the like. But we're going to move more to remote monitoring of people with long-term conditions at home. There's no question about that, I think. But also, I think that practices are going to get bigger. We're going to have more salaried GPs. And we will be providing, I hope, a much more preventative service in general practice. We've got social prescribing is becoming more common. I think the opportunities for people in general practice and in primary care have never been greater, actually. I mean, I think it's a rather a sad reflection, actually, on not just on the NHS, but we do not spend enough money in primary care. And the returns, if we did spend more money on primary care, on prevention, on health rather than sickness, if I can put it in a sort of a soundbite sort of kind of a way, you know, we are a sickness service, not a health service. We do need to spend more money on prevention, on population health. We need to have much better data locally so that we can target our resources more accurately. But against that background, there's a huge, a massive future for general practice and primary care.
Question coming from Richard Worth. It will be far more effective and quicker to retain our current medical and nursing staff than to train more new ones. What should be done about it? Why are so many people retiring early, and how do we stop it? Is it the pension scheme? Is it the workload? What do you think it is?
It's a mixture of all those things, isn't it? It's partly pensions, it's partly the workload, it's partly people's work-life balance. You know, it's very, you know, the role of the GP has changed massively since in my lifetime. I mean, not having to do the out of hours thing was the biggest probably change in my lifetime in the sort of early 2000s. It's very sad. I think sometimes it's overstated. You know, a lot of GPs do still enjoy that. I mean, I meet a lot of GPs who love their job, who certainly don't want to retire early or leave. Maybe we should make it easier for people to stay. I mean, I think that the answer to the question is both, isn't it? We've got to try and make life better for people who are in the service at the moment, but we still need to train more of them as well.
So one of my questions was going to be, what do you do in your role as chair of NHS England? But certainly one of the things that you have done is appoint a new chief executive. And I don't know if you agree with this, but it's my belief that probably the single most important decision you take as a chair, if you have the opportunity, is changing your chief executive. And you have just appointed Amanda Pritchard. What were you looking for? What were your criteria? What would you and the board like her to focus on?
It's quite interesting because when we appointed Amanda, I mean, one of the sort of Twitter things that came through, which I might add were nearly all very positive, it was shock. NHS have appointed someone who knows something about healthcare. You know, so I mean, Amanda, you know, after
it's a strange comment in the light of Simon Stevens, who knew a great deal about healthcare.
He also knew a great deal about healthcare. I mean, Amanda's journey has been different to Simon's. I mean, hers has been a very much more of an operational one at Chelsea and Westminster, and then Guidance and Thomas's. And she came to us. We recruited her as the Chief Operating Officer 2 years ago. So we got to know her very well during this COVID time. And she is a very exceptional individual. But you asked me about strengths. And I think there's two I would just pick out. One is people. I mean, the culture of the NHS has not always been quite what we would like. And I think she will change the culture of the NHS. She'll change the leadership style at the top of the NHS. And secondly, given her background, she will be very, very operational and delivery driven. And I mean, she's been there, she's got the T-shirt. So I think it's her ability to change the culture of the organization, and then to lead from the front, the sort of operational performance of the NHS. I think those are the two things that I think are most important about Amanda.
Okay, thank you. So maybe just to finish, we can change the subject and talk a little bit about the House of Lords. So you sit in the House of Lords, you've sat in the House of Lords for a number of years now. It's obviously been subject to much criticism over the years for a variety of reasons. Some people seem to be commenting that its nature has changed because it's expanded so much and there have been so many prime ministers who've appointed all their friends and staff at the end of their term of office. What's your view on the House of Lords and its position in Parliament and the nation's governance system? And how would you take things forward?
Well, look, Richard, I think the first thing to say, it is too big and too old. I mean, that's, I think, a given. I mean, it's ridiculous that there's, 900 members to the House of Lords. It's the biggest second chamber in the world, I think. So it's too big. It needs to be made. It needs to be smaller. I do think there is an argument for a second house, just at times to make the House of Commons think again. Apart from anything else, but also to scrutinise legislation. So I think there's definitely a role there. I don't think it should be elected myself. I have sort of seesawed around on that issue over the years, but if it is elected, it will become a competitive. It will compete with the House of Commons, and I don't think that will be helpful. So I think its powers should be limited. I think an independently appointed House of Lords would be the right way through, where it wasn't subject to prime ministerial patronage. There will be an independent committee to decide who should go on it. I mean, that's not perfect, but I think it will be better than where it is at the moment. So, I mean, the short answer is there is a role for a second chamber, but the second chamber as it is currently constituted is far from ideal.
So you would say, I mean, if I said to you, is it doing a good job? How would you answer that? It's obviously a critical part of the whole infrastructure of the nation.
I think it does a good job sort of despite itself in a way, because there are enough people there with experience. I mean, if you take healthcare, for example, there's probably 20 or 30 senior clinicians in the House of Lords, and quite a number of very distinguished scientists as well, all who contribute. So I think despite itself, the House of Lords does, a reasonably good job.
Okay, so as you look back on your career, you've talked about your affection and stimulation that you got out of working at British Steel. What are you proudest of all the variety of things you've done in the political, private, and public sector? What will you show at the pearly gates for your entrance ticket?
Well, I'll pick on something that is a bit different, if you like, because I mean, a lot of the things I've done in the NHS have been, I've loved every minute of it. Actually, in the NHS, it's been a fantastic experience. But when I was at the Norfolk and Norwich, I teamed up with a failing school in a very deprived part of Norwich, and it became an academy school. And it partly with our help, it was transformed. But from there, I helped set up a free school in Norwich, which became 3 free schools in Norwich from scratch. And if you've ever been involved in setting up a new school, it is a complete nightmare. And the risks you carry, personal risks you carry, are huge. Not least because of all the potential things that can go wrong with children, for whom you have a duty of care. But that resulted in 3 very successful free schools in Norwich, which are now part of a small academy group of about, I think there are now 7 other academy schools and 3 free schools. And actually, if you really want to make a difference, you need to get into education, because the problems we have as a society, if they can ever be changed by government or other involvement, it has to be in schools, particularly in the early years of schools between sort of 5 and 13. So I would point that as an area where I think actually I was part of, along with others, including Rachel D'Souza, I might add, who is now the Children's Commissioner, who was our first head teacher, I think we did make a big difference there. And so I would put that on the table, I think.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think that probably is the time to draw things to a close. So David Prior, Lord Prior, thank you very much indeed for your time this evening. Some very interesting and thought-provoking observations. It's been great to have you talking about your career and particularly talking about the NHS, as I say, what is a critical, I suppose, in a way, inflection point in the life of the service. And we wish you and all the people in NHS England all the best to spend the extra money wisely. Just in closing, I'd like to draw people's attention to 2 future events at the RSM. Firstly, next Wednesday, the 15th of September, Mike Brearley will be in Conversation live at 7 p.m. And then the following Wednesday, the 22nd, very topically, there is a session on vaccines and variants with a number of expert interviewers and commentators present for what is, I think, a 3-hour occasion starting at 12:30 on the 22nd. So those are 2 future events to look out for. It only remains for me to thank all of you for participating, to thank the RSM team for their hard work in putting this together and making sure the technology works okay. And first and foremost, and lastly, to thank David very much for your time and your openness and your frankness. It's much appreciated. Thank you very much, everybody. Good night.